Thank you, Arnie. And may God bless the reading of the scriptures this morning, and may the words from my mouth be what each of us needs to hear. Our reading this morning, as we've talked to the kids about a little bit, is about a wedding reception. A wedding reception that could have been a disaster, but it ended up being a huge success because Jesus was there. You know the story. The wedding took place at Cana. Mary, Jesus' mother, was at that wedding, and so was Jesus, and so were his disciples. Something very serious happened. We all know what that was. They ran out of wine. Oh, no. Weddings in that day, like they are now, were a really big deal. It was normal to have so much food and so much wine at a wedding that there would always be leftovers when the wedding reception was over. Running out of food or wine just was not something that was allowed to happen. You just didn't run out of either one of those things. So if you did, it was more than just an embarrassment. It was a very serious problem. But that's what happened at this wedding. And Mary came to Jesus and said, "Bad news, they're out of wine." Jesus' answer was surprising when we look at it at its face value. It says that Jesus said, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." Well, what he's saying is, why are you asking me? It's not time for me to begin to show people who I am and what I am capable of. But his answer to his mother was not really as harsh as it sounds in English. In its original language, it really wasn't impolite at all. And Mary was not offended in any way by what he said. And she said, in fact, to the servants, the people that were working there at the reception, do whatever he tells you to do. And so that's always good advice. Do whatever Jesus tells you. You can't go wrong. Well, there were 6 stone water jars, we're told, and they each held about 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to these servants there, fill those jars with water. And so they filled the jars with water, as he said. And he told them, now, dip some out and take it to the guy in charge of the banquet and see what he thinks. So they did. And the guy in charge of the banquet, the master of the banquet, tasted the water, and it wasn't water. It had been turned into wine. He didn't know where this wine had come from, but the servants knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he complimented him. He said, it's pretty typical fashion. The normal way we do this is we usually bring out the really good tasting wine first while the people are sober, and then the cheaper wine, we bring that out later after the guests have had too much to drink and they don't notice it as much. But you have saved the best wine until the end. Then John says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. Now, most of us are familiar with this story, Jesus turning water into wine. But I think there are a couple of lessons to be found in this simple story. First of all, one is that miracles in the New Testament were signs that Jesus was who he said he was. They were proof, if you will. Jesus says that miracles, I should say, that miracles don't happen just because Jesus has extra love for someone. In other words, miracles don't happen for some people and not for others because he loves that person who receives that miracle more than he loves the one who didn't. God has equal love, absolutely equal love for each and every one of his children. He loves you every bit as much as he loves me, anybody else in this room, any of the 18 plus people who are watching us on YouTube right now. He loves God. God loves us just as much. One just as much as another. If Jesus' love was the only reason, then we would all experience miracles all the time because of his great love. Nobody would be sick. Nobody would be in need of anything in this world. We would just ask God for a miracle and God would grant it. But as we all know, life doesn't happen like that, does it? There's a reason that miracles are rare in this world. Albert Einstein, I think, was right when he said, God doesn't play dice with the universe. God created the natural order of things and announced that it was good. Think about it. As far as we know, to this point, Earth is the only planet in the universe that supports intelligent life. What an amazing planet God has given us to live on. It was, at least in the beginning, perfectly balanced. Just enough light, just enough darkness, just enough moisture, just enough dry land, just enough heat, just enough of everything, perfectly balanced to keep us all alive. Now, we've done some things to interfere with the process, unfortunately, and so some of those balances are being thrown off. But even God seems to hesitate to interfere with the process of nature and with allowing the process of nature to take place. And that may be why miracles seem to be so rare. I'm talking about miracles that completely defy the laws of nature. It's interesting, even the miracles that Jesus performed followed God's natural laws. A perfect example is our story today, turning water into wine. Someone said to me once, and it sort of stuck with me, water is being changed into wine every day in vineyards, in Northern California, and all over the world right now. Think about that for a second. Water is being changed to wine all over the world, it's true, in grapevines, and then through the process of fermentation. And it's a natural process of nature, but it takes time. See, in C.S. Lewis' book called Miracles, he writes that in every one of Jesus' miracles, Jesus remained true to the laws of nature. He just hurried up the natural process. For example, it takes a long time to produce wine from water using grapevines and fermentation tanks, but Jesus did it instantly. What Mother Nature takes a whole lot longer to do. Jesus did it all within God's natural order. He didn't break God's natural law. This universe is a miracle itself. God created it to be amazing and beautiful and bountiful, producing everything that we need for this life. But there are certain laws. What happens, for example, if you step out in front of a speeding car, but before you do that, you say a prayer that the laws of gravity and momentum will be paused for you so that you will be saved and you'll stay alive. And then you step in front of a car. What happens? You're going to get killed, right? You're going to be disappointed, but anybody watching is going to be more than disappointed. Can you imagine the chaos if the law of gravity were even suspended for even 1 second? Planes would fall. No, they wouldn't fall. They'd go the other way. They'd go up into space. Dishes would fly out of their cabinets. We'd be floating around. Even God does not play with the wondrous laws of nature. If you wonder why God doesn't perform more miracles in our lives, it may be part of the answer. He allows nature to take its course. And I'm not saying that great miracles don't happen, because they do. There are people sitting in this room who are living examples of miracles, and they do happen. But may I suggest that one reason that the miracles do happen, when they do, is to remind us that God is who God says he is, and that he is present with us. He's here. We sometimes have beautiful things happen in our lives. Sometimes we have things happen that we cannot explain. There have been folks who I've talked to who have gone to the doctor, been diagnosed with some terrible illness, and then after a certain period of time, I've heard this story a few times in my ministry, they go back to the doctor, they're re-examined, and it's gone. Can't explain why. That's called a miracle. That's God. That's God being in control. That's God working in our lives. I read a miracle story about a lady who was visiting a businessman's office, and while they talked, she noticed that he had a little paperweight on his desk, and it was a clear paperweight, and in the center of it was a dime, 10 cents. And she was curious, so she asked him, why did he have that on his desk? And he told her a story of a miracle. He said that when he was in college, he and his roommate were down to their last dime. His roommate was on a scholarship. He earned his tuition by working 2 jobs in a cotton field and a store. And they were the first 2 in their families to go to college. And their parents were really proud of them because they were the first in the family to go. Each month, their family sent them money to buy food, but that month, no check came. It was the 5th or 6th of the month, and between the 2 of them, they had 1 dime, and that was it. Well, that was in the days of payphones. Remember those payphones? You had to put money in? Yeah. And it cost them a dime to make a call. So they used that dime to call home to one of the parents and ask when their check would be arriving from their parents. Well, the mother answered the phone, and they could tell right away from her voice that something was wrong. And his father had been sick, and he'd been out of work, so there was no money. They weren't going to be able to send him any money that month. So he said that his parents told him that he'd also talked to the other roommate's parents. They were from the same town, and they didn't have any money to send that month either. They were broke. So there they were. They were sorry, but they said it looked like they'd have to come home. They put off telling them, hoping that something would happen, that some money would fall into their hands, but it didn't happen. Well, obviously, both of these boys were devastated. They had 1 month left to finish their school year. Then they could work all summer to make some money for school next year. It was then that the miracle happened. They finished their conversation. He hung up the phone. When he hung up the phone, dimes started pouring out of the phone. It was crazy. They were laughing and holding out their hands and catching it with their shirts, and all these dimes kept falling out. And other students walking down the hall thought they were nuts. Nobody would know if they took the money, they thought. But then they decided they weren't going to do that because that would be stealing. And so they tried to return these dimes. They called the operator and told her what happened. She said that the money belonged to the telephone company, so replace it in the phone. They tried to put dimes back in the phone, it wouldn't go. They just fell through. He told the operator that the dimes kept falling back out, and she said, well, I don't know what else to do, but let me talk to my supervisor. I'll be right back. And she came back, and she said that my supervisor tells me that you guys are going to have to keep the money because the company's not going to send anybody out there to the school just to collect a few dollars worth of dimes. And so they said thank you, and they went back to their dorm room. They counted the money. They had $7.20. Back then, that was a lot of money. So they used that money to buy food at the grocery store, and then they were going to go job hunting after that. Well, when they went to the grocery store and they told the manager of the store what had happened as they paid for their food with their dimes, he offered them both jobs starting the next day. They were able to buy enough supplies to last them until their next paycheck, and so they were able to stay in school. To make a long story short, they finished college. They were the first in their families to do it, and they credited their graduation back to that day when that miracle happened at the payphone. And they both, to this day, believe that that was an act of God. Was it an act of God? I don't know. All I can say is that many of us have had experiences that seem to have no other explanation. I've seen it happen. I've heard many wonderful stories, and I know many of you have too. It's probably best in this life if we don't depend on miracles and focus on living the way that God would have us to live and trust that God will provide us with what we need. And if God gives us a miracle, well, then let's see it as a sign that God is present, and let's give thanks. I'm going to finish with a story about a man named Millard Reed. Millard got very sick. He was rushed to the hospital. His liver was shutting down. The doctor said he was going to die. But a lot of people prayed for Millard, and when a new liver was found for him and transplanted, he recovered. One day when he was back in Nashville at home, he decided to go for a walk. It was springtime, and there were flowers growing in his neighbor's yard, and he stopped to look at them, and there was a bumblebee buzzing around the flowers from one blossom to another. And then this bumblebee did something strange and amazing. It started flying straight at Millard. And before it got to him, suddenly it did a perfect loop-de-loop right in front of him, like a stunt plane. And then it went back to the flowers where it had started. Well, this took Millard by surprise. He remembered the book of Job and how God at one point had asked Job if he could make a horse or if he could make a whale or any of the other magnificent creatures that God had put in the world. And Millard said he could almost hear God saying to him, Millard, if I could make that crazy bumblebee do that, I could give you a new liver. And Millard said that he began to cry. He was still crying when he got back to his house a few minutes later. His wife thought something was wrong with him. He said, oh no, these are tears not of sadness, tears of joy. I'm just so happy to be alive in God's beautiful world. Millard had seen God in a bumblebee. He had seen God in his doctors finding and placing a new liver in his body. We got a guy in this room that can relate to this story, right, Aaron? He had seen God in all those people who had prayed for him and supported him through his time of illness. He knew that these were all miracles, miraculous signs that God was present, was with him through it all. Have you seen miracles? I hope so. Because if you do, if you have, that means you are tuned in to God's presence in your life. Let's keep our eyes open. Let's watch for miracles, even the little ones. Amen.